The date usually passes the way every anniversary of that marriage has passed since 1996, in silence, unmentioned, treated by the family as a private matter that ended badly and stayed that way.
There's no statement for this one, no press release, no photograph approved in advance, no line in the court circular. Nobody at Kensington Palace had scheduled a single word about the date. Charles and Diana were married at St. Paul's Cathedral 45 years ago this week. The anniversary has passed every year since 1996, the same way. In silence. Unmentioned. Treated by the family as a private matter that ended badly, and stayed that way. Then the evening before the anniversary, a 13-year-old boy walked into the sunken garden at Kensington Palace carrying something small enough to close inside one hand. No press office approval, no photographer, nobody watching the statue that week had been told to expect anything at all. What he brought that evening has a wedding day history far older than either of his parents, and how it reached him, more than what it actually was, is what turned one quiet visit into a story the whole family is now talking about. The wedding itself needs little introduction. Pretty 9th of July, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral, watched by 750 million people, a dress with a 25-foot train, a fairy tale so perfectly constructed that it took roughly 11 years to fully come apart. But there's a smaller detail, one that gets left out of anniversary retellings, and it's the detail that matters here. Since 1858, every royal bride has carried a sprig of myrtle in her bouquet. The tradition began with Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, using cuttings from a myrtle bush still growing today in the grounds of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Custom holds that a cutting from each bride's sprig is sent back to Osborne afterward and replanted. Diana's sprig in 1981 came from that original plant, so did Catherine's in 2011. Different women, different decades. Same Bush royal historian Hugo Vickers has written that the myrtle tradition is one of the few pieces of wedding ritual to survive, largely unnoticed into the modern era, overshadowed by tiaras and headlines, but unbroken since Victoria's day, regardless of how any individual marriage turned out. The sunken garden where Diana's memorial statue stands has no ceremonial connection to the myrtle tradition. No link, no precedent, nothing written down anywhere that would explain what happened next. That is the gap a 13-year-old closed on his own. According to Hello magazine, which first reported the detail, the sprig did not come from Osborne House. It came from a cutting kept inside Kensington Palace's own walled garden, grown from stock descended from the original plant, normally reserved for family weddings. Not memorials, not anniversaries, weddings. Nobody has explained on the record how a request for it reached the gardening staff, or who signed off on cutting a wedding flower for a garden that has never in 5 years hosted one. The request came anyway, and it was granted. A source close to the household says George's interest didn't begin with the anniversary at all. It began weeks earlier when he came across a photograph of his grandmother on her wedding day and asked his father what she had been holding. William didn't simply answer the question. He is said to have arranged it himself. No equerry, no private secretary, no press office, so that his son could have a sprig of his own. The heir to the throne, authorizing on his own initiative, without telling anyone, paid to manage the family's image. The first real crack in almost 30 years of official silence about his parents' marriage. He didn't call it anything. He didn't frame it as a moment. He just answered his son's question, and then made sure the answer came with something real to hold. 2 days later, on the evening of 28th July, with no press notified and no photographer pressing, George walked into the sunken garden with a single protection officer. He knelt at the base of his grandmother's statue for less than a minute. He didn't leave the myrtle on the plinth where flowers are normally placed for photographs. He pressed it into the soil at the statue's feet instead, low enough that a visitor the next morning would need to know exactly where to look to find it. Then he stood, said nothing anyone recorded, and left the way he came. What he said, if he said anything at all while he knelt there, has not been repeated by anyone in a position to have heard it. He is Diana's eldest grandchild, born almost 16 years after she died. He has never heard her voice except in recordings, never been held by her, never had the particular experience of being known by the woman whose memory he pressed into the soil that evening. What he had was a photograph, a question, a father who answered it, and a sprig of myrtle from a bush that supplied the same flower to the same woman on the most photographed day of her life. He brought it to a statue in a garden and knelt for a minute. That is all, and somehow that is everything. What happened to his grandfather once the detail reached him did not stay private for nearly as long. Charles was told the following morning, before his official engagements began. According to a source who spoke to the Daily Mail, he did not say much when he heard it. He asked one question, exactly where at the statue's base the myrtle had been left, then said nothing else on the subject for the rest of the day. What he did instead was clear one appointment that had been in his diary for weeks and go to the sunken garden himself, alone except for a single protection officer, on the morning of 29th July. The anniversary. That sounds small. A king standing by a statue for a few minutes before breakfast. It wasn't. Charles has never been photographed at Diana's memorial since it was unveiled in 2021. Not on an anniversary, not on her birthday, not once in 5 years. Camille. A was not there. No statement was issued. No court photographer had been briefed because none had been told to come. The only record of the visit came from staff who happened to be tending the same garden that had supplied the myrtle 3 days before. They described a man standing still for longer than the visit strictly required, hands in his coat pockets, looking down at a patch of soil rather than up at the statue itself. He knew where to look because his grandson had told him, not directly, not in words, but by pressing something small into the soil low enough that only someone who had been told would know to look there. This is where a marriage the palace spent almost 30 years declining to discuss gets acknowledged, in its own understated way, by the two people who lived it and the one who never got the chance to. William answered his son's question about a photograph. George turned that answer into a gesture at a statue. Charles, the following morning, went to say something no one recorded to a woman he married 45 years ago, divorced 15 years into it, and lost roughly a year after that. Nothing about it looks coordinated, and that is precisely what makes it hold together. George's request started with a photograph, not an instruction. William's help started with a father answering a question, not a PR plan. Charles's visit came a full day after the fact, once he already knew what had happened without him, and once there was nothing left to arrange, only somewhere to stand. 3 people, a generation apart, arriving separately at roughly the same instinct, none of them waiting for the other 2 to go first. Royal wedding anniversaries are not, as a rule, occasions the palace marks once a marriage has ended. This one had ended twice over, first in divorce, then in something nothing could undo. There was never an obligation for anyone to remember 29th July at all. That a 13-year-old chose to anyway, without being asked, without being told it was expected, without knowing he was quietly ending 3 decades of silence, says something about how the next reign may hold Diana's memory. Not through renamed gardens or official portraits, not through carefully worded statements approved by a communications team. Through small, specific gestures a child decides on his own are worth doing. It suggests the family's relationship with this particular date was never really resolved by 30 years of silence. It was only paused, waiting for someone young enough not to know he wasn't supposed to mark it. Diana chose a sprig of myrtle for her own wedding at 20, from a bush she likely never thought about again. Years later, her grandson chose the same flower from the same lineage for a garden built to remember her instead. He knelt for less than a minute. He pressed it low enough that you'd need to know where to look, and somehow the whole family found their way there. I don't have a question for the comments this time. I just want to know what this story made you feel. Leave it below. The one-word answers matter just as much as the long ones. If this video gave you something quiet to sit with, hit the like button, and subscribe if you haven't yet, because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones nobody scheduled. See you in the next one.